Okay, so today we're going to talk about language paper 2, question 5. Now, this question is one where lots of people get stuck in mid-level marks, and I'm going to explain in this video how you go about doing it so you can get out of that trap, separate yourself away from most of the candidates that are going to answer this question and reach those top level marks. So we've already done 4 questions. We've already done our reading section for language paper 2. We looked at our 2 sources and compared them and answered our 4 questions, and then we've got to question 5. Question 5 worth 40 marks. It's worth half of the marks of the paper. The paper is worth 80 marks altogether, and you're going to spend about 45 minutes on it, about an hour on the reading section, about 45 minutes on this writing section. Now, having already watched my video on language paper 1, question 5, the first bit of creative writing, I'll tell you that the mark scheme for this question is exactly the same. It's marked in exactly the same way. Now, you've got to pay attention to this, because this is where we start to get into the really high level marks or get stuck in those mid-level marks. So if we have a look at the mark scheme again, this is what it looks like in the actual mark scheme. Here's my simplified version of it, not in kind of education management speak that you get in mark schemes. We're looking for 40 marks, 24 marks that are based on the actual content of the writing, 16 marks based on the accuracy, and you want to ask yourself these questions about your piece of writing. So those 24 marks, the more important questions: does the writing suit the task? Does it have ambitious vocabulary? Have you used language devices and used them well? Have you structured it well? And down at the bottom are 16 marks for accuracy. You want to be thinking about, are your sentences accurate and varied? Have you used a variety of punctuation accurately? Is the spelling correct? And have you used vocabulary well? Okay. Now, the difference between this one and the language paper 1 creative writing is you only get one task, and you have to complete this task. You don't get an option. So let's have a look at an example question. Generally, you'll get a statement up at the top, and then you'll be asked to do a bit of writing about that statement. So in this one, a real exam question from the exam board: our addiction to cheap clothes and fast fashion means young people in poorer countries have to work in terrible conditions to make them. We must change our attitude to buying clothes now. Write an article for a magazine or website in which you argue your point of view on this statement. Now, first off, that statement up at the top is generally going to be something that they think most 15, 16-year-olds in the country have some sort of opinion on. If it's something you're passionate about, great. If you haven't got an opinion on it, we'll come to that later and how to deal with that situation. But the key thing, if we go back to our mark scheme, that does it suit the task, the most important thing up at the top, we've got to think about what style of writing we're doing. And the key questions we want to ask ourselves here are: what are we being asked to write, and who are we being asked to write to? So in our example question, write an article for a magazine or a website, we've got to write an article. I'll show you a little bit from the exam board where they talk about the sort of audiences you might get, the sort of people you've got to write to, and the sort of writing that you might have to do, right? So it says, range of audiences that can be set. Given the need for this task to provide students with an opportunity to meet the full requirements of AO6, that's your accuracy marks down at the bottom, the audiences will be formal in nature. So they're going to usually ask you to write to a politician or a head of school, or do a speech for a leavers assembly or something like that. It's unlikely they're going to ask you to write a text to a mate, so you're writing it in a really sort of chatty style. And then we've got range of forms down at the bottom. These are the sorts of things they might ask you to write. So you might be asked to write a letter, an article, text for a leaflet, text of a speech, or an essay. Now, key thing here, to separate yourself out from the crowd, right? If you ask to write a letter, all you need to do is start it with "Dear whoever," right? And then write in that sort of style that's going to suit the audience you're being asked to write towards. If you're asked to write an article, it needs to be slightly chatty in the way that you're talking about, but you're still going to push your vocabulary, and we'll come onto that later because you want to hit those marks, right? Text for a leaflet is relatively straightforward and informative and similar on essay. With a speech, you want to start it with, ladies and gentlemen, this morning I'm here to talk to you, and try and think about little stylish touches you can put in there to indicate it's a speech. You don't have to do much with this. Some people will tell you for a letter you've got to write out the big formal address and all that kind of thing. Honestly, if you're going to separate yourself out from most of the people writing this question, if you've made some reference to writing an article, a speech somewhere in there, you're going to get decent marks for doing it. Okay, so let's have a look then about how we're going to plan this question. The exam board constantly tells us with writing, people who plan will do better than people who don't, right? Our marks up at the top of our mark scheme there, where it says, have you structured your work well? If you haven't planned, it's unlikely you're going to structure your work well. So let's see how we go about doing it. If we take any example question, right? You want to think about whether you do actually agree or disagree with this statement, right? If you've got no opinion on it at all, here's how you get around that. Think of opinionated people that you know, people who are always spouting off their opinion. And preferably, if you can think of 2 that usually argue with each other, that's useful. What would be their opinion on this, right? If you've got no opinion at all. And then be as specific as possible. If you agree with it, why do you agree with it? What is it about it that makes you agree with this statement? Try and go through that process and jot down, bullet point a couple of ideas. Don't write them out in full, just go, I kind of think this and I kind of think this. So for our addiction to cheap clothes and fast fashion, for example, you might talk about the fact that people are used to paying this amount at this point. It's very difficult for you not to pay a small amount for clothes that you're used to paying a small amount for. You might talk about the clothing companies and it's their responsibility. They keep selling it at these prices, so how could we resist buying them at these prices? You might, on the other side, talk about the appalling conditions of sweatshops and how people are forced into sort of child labour or things like that, right? Any ideas you've got, jot all of those down, right? When you work out your order of those ideas, what you want to try and pick are ideas where you have to get into a bit of detail or a bit of description about what's going on, right? Anything where you can paint a bit of a picture, so give a real world example or kind of describe a particular scene, because you're going to get good marks for doing that, right? And what you also want to do is come up with 2 or maybe 3 ideas on your side, right? So I think this, I think this, I think this. These are reasons why I'll prove what I say. And then look at the other side of the argument. So I could see why somebody else might argue this on the other side, or I can see why this thing happens because of this, and then finish it off with a really clear statement and a call to action. This is what you should be doing about it. Right? That gives you a nice clear structure. It gives you several reasons to go through. It gives you another side, so you're sort of flipping it and looking at the other side of the argument, and you're finishing with a nice clear ending to it. Okay? Now, here's where we get into the bit where you're going to hit the higher level marks, right? The thing that most people get wrong on this question is that they tie it into the same style of writing that you have in question 1 to 4 in your reading section. Question 1 to 4 in your reading section, you're just basically explaining your ideas and telling me in as much detail as possible, this is what I think. And what tends to happen is mid-level people on this question, question 5, will do exactly the same thing. They'll just explain their ideas. Now, actually, the exam board doesn't really care that much about the ideas that you put into this. What they mainly care about is the style of the writing. So if you've made it an entertaining piece of writing, even if the ideas aren't actually that good, you're probably going to do better than somebody who just explains ideas. Let's have a look and I'll show you what I mean, right? I'm going to give you an example of a mid-level candidate. So the question here is, adults set a bad example to children with their attitude to alcohol. Write an article for your school newspaper on whether you agree or disagree with the statement. Here's what they wrote. Drugs are a problem in this country, but they are not as big a problem as alcohol. Alcohol is a legal social drug used by supposedly responsible adults. Everyone complains about illegal drugs and the kids that take them, but just because you drink alcohol rather than taking it in any other way doesn't make it healthy. If it's taken in excess. I know that 1 glass of red wine is supposed to be beneficial for the heart. 1 glass of red wine a day for medical reasons is responsible consumption of alcohol, but I'm talking about drinking to excess, which is what a lot of adults do. That's not a bad point, right? Kind of explained in a bit of detail, I kind of agree with what they're saying, but actually they're not going to do very well because the vocabulary is fine, but they've not really pushed it. They haven't really got different styles of sentences in there. They haven't really used any language devices. They haven't really thought about different types of punctuation in there. All of the little hoops you've got to jump through, they've missed all of those. Now let's have a look at another example. Snow seems exciting, but it's actually a cause of accidents and misery. Write an article for a news website explaining how far you agree with this statement. Snow. Picture the scene. You awake to a world camouflaged by a beautiful, pristine blanket of that mystical white stuff that instantly brings us back to our childhood. Rosy goes on tiny cheeks, exhilarating sledge rides, endless snowball battles across acres of powdery, wonderful, magical flakes. All that stuff. So why must we feel constantly guilty for our feelings of nostalgic reverie? Because of old people, obviously. Oh, my carburettor was flooded by ice. Oh, my poor arthritic knees. Oh, I can still feel a slight chill despite my 12 cardigans, 3 gas fires and ridiculously worn slippers. It's absolutely pathetic. Now, the actual idea that they've got in here, I don't think is quite as strong as the idea from before, but they're going to get really good marks, and here's why. We've got a short sentence used for effect, right? If we have a look at our mark scheme down at the bottom, have you got, are your sentences accurate and varied? Yes, they've done that. Longer descriptive ones, shorter dramatic ones. Have we chosen ambitious vocabulary? We've got exhilarating in there in sledge rides. We've got nostalgic reverie in there, okay? Beautiful, pristine blanket of that mystical white stuff. All good in terms of vocabulary. Also, language devices. Now, there are plenty of these, and I'm going to go through them in a different video, but they've got similes and metaphors in there. Okay, so we've got our pristine blanket of mythical stuff, that metaphorical language. We've got groups of 3, which are really useful to put in there. So powdery, wonderful, magical flakes, any little group of 3 like that is a really useful rhetorical device. We've got rhetorical questions that don't really need an answer. So why must we feel constantly guilty for our feelings of nostalgic reverie? Okay, all good, right? Anything like that shows that they're jumping through hoops. Also, different types of punctuation. We've got a question mark in there. We've got some semicolons. We've got a couple of little bits of speech in there, right? They know the hoops they've got to jump through in order for the example to get them marks, and that's why this example is going to do much better than the one before.